Hello, Brubs. We're back with Buried Alive, the terrifying history of our most primal fear by Jan Bondeson. We are on the last chapter, chapter 12. Let me put this into the computadore. We are ready. Hello, Brubs. Got some more, what's it called? What's this called? Oh, a book. Hell yeah, buddy. It's book time. It's book time. I'll finish this fucker up today. Buried Alive, the terrifying history of our most primal fear. Are people still being buried alive? There was a young man at Nunhead who awoke in a coffin of lead. It is cozy enough, he remarked in a huff, but I wasn't aware I was dead. Anonymous limerick reproduced in Burial Reformer 1, 1908. Cute. After the Great War, the popular fear of premature burial decreased considerably. Although both medical and non medical writings on the subject continued to appear, the London Society for the Prevention of Premature Burial and similar organizations elsewhere declined. This was due largely to the medical breakthroughs of the time, which led to an increased confidence in the medical profession. But it does not mean that accidents like those recounted earlier were totally eradicated. It still occasionally happened that some presumed corpse came to life in the morgue or even in the coffin, but the subject had lost some of its power to fascinate the public. In the summer of 1950, Dr. D.K. Briggs of Blackville, South Carolina, was called to attend year the 30-year-old black woman Essie Dunbar to attend the 30-year-old black woman Essie Dunbar, who had suffered an attack of epilepsy. No, he found no signs of life and declared her dead. The corpse was put in a wooden coffin, and the funeral arranged for 11 in the following morning to give Essie's sister, who lived in a neighboring town, the chance to participate. Although the ceremony was a lengthy one, with three preachers taking turns to perform, the sister had still not arrived when Essie's coffin was lowered into its 6 foot deep grave. She appeared a few minutes later, however, and the ministers agreed to dig up the coffin so that she might see Essie one last time. But when the screws were removed and the coffin lid opened, Essie sat up in her coffin and smiled at her sister. The three ministers fell backward into the grave, the shortest suffering three broken ribs, as the other two trampled him in their desperate efforts to get out. The mourners, including Essie's sisters, believed that she was a ghost and fled yelling. When they saw that Essie, who had climbed up from the grave, was actually pursuing them, they stampeded into town in a state of complete hysteria. For many years, Essie Dunbar was viewed with suspicion in the neighborhood. There were rumors that she was a zombie who had returned from the dead. In later life, she became a popular local personality, and it is by no means unlikely that the story of her resurrection from the tomb was somewhat improved upon as it was told and retold, and finally appeared in the newspapers after her second and final death in 1955. Probably the most remarkable 20th century instance of alleged premature burial, although dependent on newspaper evidence, is that of the Frenchman Angelo Hayes from the village of San Quentin, or is it Saint Quentin, des Chalets. In 1937, when he was 19 years old, his motorcycle skidded out of control. He was thrown from the vehicle and hit a brick wall head first. When Dr. Bathius, the local practitioner, attended him, he shook his head. Young Hayes was a dreadful sight. With a serious head injury. Is this light on? Oh, yeah, it's on. There was no pulse or respiration, and the doctor could hear no heartbeat with the stethoscope. Angelo Hayes was declared dead and his body taken to the local morgue. His parents were not allowed to see the corpse since the injury looked too dreadful. 3 days after the accident, his body was buried. The coffin was carried to the grave by 8 of his friends from the local volunteer fire brigade. But in nearby Bordeaux, an insurance firm discovered that Angelo Hayes's father had recently insured his son's life for 200,000 francs. An inspector was sent to Saint Quentin des Chalets to investigate the accident. A farmer confessed that his tractor had leaked oil and that this had caused Hayes's motorbike to skid out of control. But the determined inspector decided to have the body exhumed to ascertain the exact cause of death. 2 days after the funeral, Angelo Hayes's coffin was dug up and taken to a forensic institute in Bordeaux. When the doctor in charge removed the shroud, he felt that the body was still warm. Hayes was taken to a hospital in an ambulance after several operations and a long period of rehabilitation. He recovered completely. He had been deeply unconscious during his 2 days in a coffin underground. The earth had been very dry and had not been stamped down over the coffin. It was supposed that he would have suffocated had the head injury not led to a diminished demand for oxygen. After his resurrection, Angelo Hayes became quite a celebrity in France. For many years, people traveled from all parts of the country just to see and to speak with him. In the 1970s, Hayes decided to try to make money from the fame that followed his amazing rescue from the tomb. He invented a security coffin that was something of an improvement on Count de Carnicki's late 19th century model. The super coffin cost £4,500, as much as an automobile, and lacked nothing in luxury, being equipped with thick upholstering and a soft pillow for the head. It was high enough for the buried individual to be able to sit up, and had a library of books the victim could read while awaiting rescue. The coffin's food locker was supplied with rations like those of the American astronauts. The controls at the coffin's dashboard maneuvered the oxygen supply from large gas tubes. The ventilation fan, the air pumps, the chemical toilet, the electrical alarm, and the shortwave radio transmitter and receiver, which work through an aerial sticking up above the earth. Several extra gadgets like a small oven, a refrigerator, and a hi-fi cassette player attached to the radio were optional. Hayes went on tour with his coffin and became a media star. During the shows, he let himself be buried in the coffin to demonstrate that it was fully functional. At a demonstration in Bordeaux, 25,000 paying spectators came to see him, and the take from this and a series of other shows brought him a handsome profit, although few, if any, of his security coffins found buyers. Hayes himself boasted that a wealthy 93-year-old Frenchwoman had ordered 2 coffins, one for herself and one for her niece. The niece presumably did not much appreciate the macabre present from her dismal tante de inheritance. At one of the shows, French television buried a camera and a microphone in the coffin with him, and the sprightly Angelo Hayes sang his favorite songs to a live TV audience. Although the acoustics in the narrow coffin cannot have benefited his performance, the program was a great success. The Monte Carlo television shows with them during the Monte Carlo television company signed a contract with him, and he recorded a series of 13 shows with them during a 5 year period. No one has doubted the amazing story of Angelo Hayes, and the fact that no journalist exposed him at the height of his fame may indicate that he was really buried alive in 1937. The only inconsistency in the various accounts of his story is that one version holds that his body was exhumed owing to insurance technicalities, another that his coffin was disinterred so that his uncle could see his body for the last time. A third version, from a notoriously unreliable source, maintains that he suffered a heart attack and actually awoke in his premature grave. Before being saved after a visitor to the churchyard heard his frantic banging against the coffin lid. Angelo Hayes' security coffin was not the last one on the market. In the 1960s, the body of a man named Archibald McLean was exhumed in Detroit. Since there was a suspicion that he might have been poisoned, the corpse was found in a horrible, unnatural position, and there was much newspaper speculation that he had been buried alive. According to a German writer, the consequence of this was that more than 3,000 Americans decided to make sure they were not buried alive by requesting that their bodies be cremated or embalmed or deliberately mutilated to safeguard against the live burial. An American firm of funeral directors could also supply a security coffin fitted with an alarm and a 72-hour supply of oxygen. The multimillionaire John Dackney had a huge security vault built for him at a churchyard in Tucson, Arizona, fitted with an alarm and with automatic steel doors that opened for 3 hours every night for the first 12 weeks. After his death in 1969, hundreds of curious onlookers gathered every night to see if Mr. Dackney would walk out when the steel doors opened, but always in vain. In the mid 1990s, the mayor of Aparecida, Brazil, built a security vault with 4 air holes for ventilation. At about the same time, a newspaper reported that the Tuscan watchmaker Fabrizio Caselli marketed a coffin equipped with a bleeping device, a telephone, a flashlight, an oxygen tube, and a heart stimulator. It sold for $3,000 or £3,000, and Caselli told the press that if sales were brisk, he hoped to establish 3 medical centers in Italy, whose sole purpose would be to respond to premature burial emergency calls. Textbooks on the current principles for declaring people dead advise caution in cases of head trauma, like that of Angelo Hayes, and epilepsy, like that of Essie Dunbar, as well as in drowning, lightning stroke, and electrocution. Hypothermia also requires special care. A person found frozen to death should not be declared dead until he or she is both warm and dead. In particular, hypothermia in combination with drug poisoning with narcotic substances can produce a remarkably death-like state without affecting the individual's chances of recovery. Knowledge of this phenomenon had existed since the mid 19th century. For example, one of Dr. Josat's patients with no audible heartbeat had taken an overdose of some narcotic substance. It was further highlighted just after the Great War. In October 1919, the 23-year-old nurse Minna Braun was sent into a Berlin pharmacy to purchase some morphine and Veronal. She then proceeded to a park in the freezing cold weather and tried to commit suicide by swallowing a very large dose of these drugs. She quickly lost consciousness and showed no signs of life when found the next day. At the local mortuary, the doctor on duty could detect no evidence of breathing or heartbeat, could provoke no reflexes, and described the body as deathly pale and rigid. Hot sealing wax was dripped on her skin as a test of life, but it elicited no reaction. Minna Braun was declared dead and her body put in a coffin. A detective came to the morgue 14 hours later to identify the deceased. When the coffin was opened, the mortuary assistant was aghast to see that the corpse moved its head. The same doctor who had declared her dead came rushing in, and this time he heard a slow heartbeat with his stethoscope. Braun was put in a hot bath and vigorously brushed with a strong, prickly brush from time to time. Artificial ventilation had to be resorted to. Wisely, the doctors decided to apply the stomach pump, and considerable amounts of morphine and barbiturates that remained in the stomach were flushed out. The patient was then put in a hospital bed. Slowly but steadily, Minna Braun recovered and was able to walk out of the hospital. One hopes that her narrow brush with death deterred her from any further suicide attempts. The doctors in charge described the case as a medical mystery. How could a human being have existed without circulation or respiration for at least 17 hours? We today know that the requirements for oxygen decreases with lower body temperature. given that the natural defense mechanisms against hypothermia, like shivering, are non functional, something that can be accomplished by an intoxication with barbiturates or other narcotic substances. At a body temperature of 20 degrees Celsius, the body's need for oxygen is just 15% of the normal oxygen intake, and this can be further lowered by a concomitant intoxication with barbiturates or other drugs with a depressing effect on the central nervous system. CNS. In such an extreme state, there may be just 10 or even fewer heartbeats per minute and just 2 to 3 respirations. It is impossible to feel a pulse or to detect any spontaneous respiration. Electrocardiography, which had been used to distinguish between life and death in difficult cases at least since the early 1930s, may be fallible in these extreme cases, since the EKG complexes seen are so severely deformed as to resemble artifacts. Similarly, electrocephalography may be fallible since the depression of the the CNS, may be profound enough to result in an isoelectric EEG with no sign whatsoever of spontaneous brain activity. Quite a few people every year try to commit suicide by taking an overdose of barbiturates or other CNS depressants while outdoors. Most of them die as a consequence of the overdose. A few are discovered while still conscious and are thus saved, and a small proportion are brought into a hospital in a death like state of extreme hypothermia, facilitated and deepened by the drug overdose. Most of these survivors are lucky enough to encounter an experienced emergency physician and to be taken into intensive care. Some others may be examined by a young, inexperienced doctor in a busy emergency room at a small hospital. This doctor is probably more concerned with keeping the conscious patients in the emergency ward alive than with spending a long time examining the lifeless cadaver of what appears to be yet another suicide. It is quite possible that under these conditions the patient can be wrongly certified to be dead. This happened to a 36-year-old woman in Sweden in 1969 and a 23-year-old woman in Liverpool in 1970, recognized to be alive by paramedical personnel prior to removal to the mortuary. Both recovered without ill effects. In 1970, the French journal La Presse Médicale detailed 3 cases of people who had attempted suicide by taking high doses of barbiturates. Despite careful monitoring of their life signs, they had been erroneously diagnosed as dead. One of them had actually recovered in his coffin. After the early 1970s, these remarkable modern cases of apparent death appear to have become a damned phenomenon, which the medical establishment no longer wishes to acknowledge. The later instances have been reported in the newspaper press only. Some of these newspaper reports are reasonably well verified, containing the names and sometimes photographs of the individual falsely declared dead. It also increases the credibility if the case has been reported by several independent national newspapers. In 1986, a 27-year-old drug abuser was found lifeless in woods near Reigate in Surrey, not far from London. According to an article in the Daily Mail, he was certified dead at the New East Surrey Hospital, Redhill. In the morgue, a technician heard spluttering sounds from the alleged corpse, but attempts at resuscitation were in vain. The man died 36 hours later. In 1988, a man in Mons, Belgium, was diagnosed as being both heart and brain dead after severe exposure to the cold. He revived after having long remained in a comatose state with a very low heart rate. According to another newspaper account, the 40-year-old Brooklyn schoolteacher Nancy Vitale was declared dead by emergency medical service technicians after being found in her basement apartment after a drug overdose in June 1993. There was no pulse and no recordable blood pressure, and the body was lifeless and rigid. 2 hours later, she gave a sputtering sound when the medical examination for determination of the cause of death was to begin. 2 days later, she was awake and could speak. In 1995, 62-year-old Daphne Banks was certified dead by her doctor after a drug overdose. Mrs. Banks was taken to the mortuary of Hinchinbrook Hospital, Huntington, United Kingdom, but was later heard snoring by a family friend who had come to take a final farewell of her. After being rushed to the hospital intensive care unit, she recovered fully. Fortunately, there are today quite a few safeguards to prevent the premature burial of one of these unfortunate individuals, particularly the examination by the police to determine the suicide's identity and the examination by mortuary workers when the corpse is prepared for burial. But if the patient's stomach is not pumped, more CNS depressant will be absorbed as the body warms up, which will slow the awakening from the coma. It would have the effect of prolonging survival inside the coffin, and a confused awakening in the narrow house below ground is a distinct possibility. The reader of this book must be interested to know whether myself whether I myself have encountered during my 15 years as a practicing physician any instance where the diagnosis of death was unclear. In 1989, I had occasion to observe a woman who had been taken to the emergency ward in a comatose state with an extremely low body temperature. She was an elderly alcoholic who had, on New Year's Eve, celebrated the occasion with several bottles of vodka. Seated on her balcony in freezing cold weather, she fell asleep out there and was well nigh dead when finally brought in. Her body temperature was far below what was considered at the time to be consistent with human life. The body was cold and deathlike, and there was no pulse to be felt. The policeman considered her to have expired, and her skinhead nephew mourned her as dead. His skinhead nephew. The electrocardiogram revealed a heart rate of 20 and waning. Through gradual extracorporeal warming of the blood by means of a heart-lung machine, her life was saved. This treatment was remarkably successful, and the woman recovered without any ill effects. Her behavior was more than a little odd, however, and the consultant anesthesiologist and I decided to speak to her relatives, raising the question whether she had suffered some residual brain damage. They replied, no, she has always been like that. Her marked obesity, isolating the inner organs from the cold, was probably to be thanked in the fortunate outcome of this case. I told her in no uncertain terms that she had been extremely lucky to have cheated the Grim Reaper, hoping that this experience would wean her from the bottle and prevent her unnecessary death from alcoholic cirrhosis of the liver. But unlike the lady with the ring and the other resuscitated heroines of 18th century fiction, she did not go on to have 26 children, weave prodigious amounts of linen, and praise the Lord in diligent prayer. All I could get from her was the comment that this experience had, indeed, taught her never to drink heavily while seated outside in sub-freezing temperatures. In 1930, there was a brief scare in France about the risk of premature burial, with an appeal to the Chamber of Deputies and some medical writing on the subject. In 1943, a German forensic specialist published an article on newspaper stories about apparent death and premature burial, proving that even in the middle of a devastating war, the German people's fascination with the Scheintod continued unabated. He contacted various colleagues at the hospitals where apparently dead people were supposed to have been risen from their coffins or awakened in the morgue. The majority of the newspaper stories turned out to be complete fabrications. One of these untrue stories allegedly took place in Istanbul. A crippled old farmer was declared dead by a doctor, but revived in his coffin the next day. He then walked into the hospital and struck the careless doctor on the head with one of his crutches. The old invalid's blow was powerful enough to crack the skull of the doctor, who fell dead to the floor. From 1945 until 1965, there was less writing about apparent death and the risk of being buried alive than in any period after 1740. But the specter of premature burial did return with a vengeance. In 1979, the first alarmist book on the subject in more than 50 years appeared, written by Jean-Yves Perron-Autry, an obscure French medical practitioner. A friend of his, Professor Louis Claude Vincent, had once been employed to check the water supply for the great American war cemeteries in Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. Observing that a good deal of excavation work was going on in the cemetery, Vincent inquired about its purpose. He was told that this was a top secret operation to determine how many of the soldiers had been buried alive and recovered consciousness inside their coffins. It concluded that 4% of the American soldiers showed unmistakable signs of having been buried alive. All 150,000 graves were opened and the remains put into new mahogany coffins after being rearranged to remove traces of broken fingers, nails embedded in the coffin lid, and skeleton hands full of human hair. Dr. Perron Autry went on to claim that the proportion of American soldiers buried alive had been the same in the recent Vietnam War in the United States. 200 heart attack victims were buried alive every day. In florid prose, he wrote that the technological advances that had taken some of their countrymen to the moon was of no avail to save these wretched Americans from the appalling fate that their ancestors had feared most of all. Dr. Perron Autry had spoken to 60 French gravediggers, all of whom told him that they had at least once dug up coffins containing evidence that living bodies had been buried in them. According to Professor Vincent, 10% of all French people were buried before they were dead. Dr. Perron Autry went on to claim that in Spain, 47 people had been buried alive between 1976 and 1978. One of these cases concerning a Spanish woman alleged to have been saved from a premature burial after spending 6 days buried in a coffin was described in grisly detail. She had scraped so hard upon the lid of the coffin that her fingers had been reduced to a mutilated mash of blood and bone, whilst her elbows, from the constant pressure, had been flayed all of skin, so much that the actual tendons were visible. Could it be said that this wretched bleeding lump of flesh was still a person, still an individual, or had it indeed been reduced to a thing? Dr. Perron Autry provides no evidence, no literature or newspaper references, even for his wildest claims. And his book is a worthy successor of those of the most fanatical 19th century and anti-premature burial propagandists like Hyacinthe Lejeune and Léonce Lenormand. These two had been relatively sincere and philanthropic individuals, but there is reason to suspect that Dr. Perron Autry was more knave than fool. His friend, Professor Vincent, had invented something he called bioelectronics, a method to detect life in the tissues of human beings, and Dr. Perron Autry demanded that this method be developed throughout the world. To describe the magnitude of the medical disaster happening all around the world, he claimed that Professor Vincent knew that 50% of all coronary victims were only apparently dead, and that 300,000 Americans were thus buried alive every year for want of bioelectronics. Dr. Perron Austre's book was translated into English in 1983, but it failed to raise the same stir abroad that it had created in its country of origin. It was mentioned in some alarmist German articles, and a similar volume soon appeared in German. While Dr. Perron Autre's deplorable volume is likely to have sprung from impure motives, the journalist Klaus Botsky's book, Scheintat Begraben, was prompted by a series of German instances of people being erroneously declared dead by qualified doctors. One example was the 80-year-old Emma Sikorsky, who had been found lifeless in her freezing cold house. The body was rigid, there was no discernible pulsations, and no heartbeat could be heard. Her pupils did not react to light. The doctor signed a death certificate stating the cause of death to have been cardiac apoplexy, and the old woman's body was taken to the undertaker's shop. Here she moved her hand and gave a sigh as the shroud was lifted. As the shroud was fitted, it turned out that, like many other victims of the 20th century variety of the Scheintat, she had taken an overdose of barbiturates. The reason her pupils had not reacted was that she had previously undergone cataract operations in both eyes. The careless doctor gave back his fee, but Frau Sikorsky's daughter successfully took him to court, and he had to pay 14,000 marks in damages. This was not the only near-fatal mistake in declaring people dead in Germany at this time. After 5 much publicized instances in 1976 and 1977, the forensic specialist Professor Hans Malik spoke up in the media, declaring that the German medical profession was losing the confidence of the public. Physicians should always rule out that the patient had taken a drug overdose before declaring him or her dead. Professor Malik claimed that one patient, the 41-year-old Monica Abelain, might have been buried alive had a policeman not seen her move while transporting her to the morgue in a van. There was much renewed interest in the Scheintat and its victims in Germany at this time, and the production of sensationalist newspaper and magazine articles almost resembled that in the 1790s. The medical debate on the subject also gathered new strength, some writers deploring that an old superstition was again raising its ugly head, and demonstrating that the alarmist articles were sometimes inventing or reusing cases in the time-honored manner described earlier. Others followed Malik in demanding burial reform, suggesting that a corps of specially trained doctors for the dead, whose only task was to verify that people were really dead before burial, be established throughout Germany. It is difficult not to link this sudden outbreak of a renewed fear of apparent death and premature burial in both Germany and France to the introduction of a new definition of death. Whole brain death, as defined by the Harvard criteria in 1968, means a permanent loss of all brain function. Persons in such a state were defined as being dead, and their organs could be transplanted into others. This redefinition of death was still being relatively smoothly introduced throughout the Western world during the 1970s and 1980s. For a person with lingering fear of premature burial, the image of the doctor whetting his scalpel near the unconscious body of an accident victim, ready to harvest the organs from this dead person, whose heart was still beating, was not a pleasant one. A deplorable feature in a 1967 issue of Newsweek was entitled, "When Are You Really Dead?" and described the transplant surgeons as ghouls ready to rip the poor accident victim open for the sake of his organs. With characteristic bluntness, Dr. Perron Autre boldly opposed the concept of brain death, claiming that many people declared brain dead could still be nursed back to life. He demanded that the ignorant doctors no longer be allowed to reign over a race of zombies, totally at their mercy when it comes to matters of life and death. Nor could Klaus Botskis resist quoting some newspaper reports of people returning to life after being declared brain dead. At least one of these concerning Michael McEldowney, who started to breathe during the operation to harvest his kidneys, appears to have been a true story. The certification of whole brain death requires evidence of cerebral unresponsivity, as determined by a neurological examination. In many countries, an EEG is mandatory, and some also a carotid angiography or a test for brainstem evoked potentials. Brainstem function must also be absent, as determined by a failure of spontaneous respiration and other neurological signs. The diagnosis for this extensive brain damage must be known, and the presence of hypothermia, drug intoxication, or other metabolic or physiologic disturbance must be ruled out with absolute certainty. In studies involving many hundreds of patients, it was found that a person fulfilling these criteria always suffered a cardiac standstill within 2 weeks. Similarly, a prospective study of more than 1,000 patients showed that individuals surviving severe head injuries would not have been suspected of being brain dead, even in their worst state soon after injury. I have been able to find only one case report in the medical literature that directly challenges the criteria of brain death by presenting the case of a patient who satisfied these criteria and had a flatline EEG but who still survived and recovered. Competent experts demonstrated this report to be completely unconvincing, however, since there was no diagnosis of irreversible structural brain damage, and because the patient had taken two drugs acting as respiratory depressants. In 1980, the BBC television documentary Panorama criticized the current criteria for declaring people brain dead, giving several American examples of tragic and sinister mistakes. The medical profession objected strongly to this sensationalist documentary, however, and could demonstrate that the cases presented, although mostly true, were all instances in which the criteria for brain death had been incompetently applied, rather than the criteria were unreliable. Of four patients, three had taken drug overdoses, and a fourth was alleged to have been purple and thrashing about. When an American neurologist allegedly declared him brain dead, a most unlikely scenario because spontaneous movement excludes this diagnosis, nevertheless, the number of donor kidneys in Britain fell considerably in the months after the Panorama documentary. This shows both the unquestionable power of today's mass media and the irresponsible way this power is often used, in this instance, most likely causing the unnecessary deaths of several renal failure patients. During the 1980s and 1990s, brain death became generally accepted. A Swedish study published in 1994 revealed that the fear of brain dead organ donors not being really dead was a very minor factor in determining people's attitudes toward organ donation. The fear of being buried alive has also become dormant, and although some scaremongering books were published in the 1990s, they failed to impress the reading public. In the United Kingdom, the well-defined concept of brainstem death, defining the brainstem as the critical system of the brain, controlling respiration, consciousness, motor output, and sensory input, has gained prominence. In the United States, the murkier concepts of neocortical death or persistent vegetative state, involving loss of higher cerebral functions, have been much discussed. But whereas a person with a destroyed brainstem will always die within 2 weeks without regaining consciousness, individuals with neocortical brain damage can still breathe and maintain blood pressure and body temperature, although they may suffer irreversible loss of consciousness and cognition. Prognostication is much more difficult with higher brain criteria. It is not just in cheap TV movies that people sometimes unexpectedly come out of lengthy comas. Doctors and philosophers alike have objected that the introduction of higher brain criteria would mark the first steps down a very slippery slope indeed. One of their arguments is that the concept of laboratories where these still breathing corpses were maintained for regular organ harvesting whenever the need occurred would be repugnant to the average person and lead to a loss of confidence in the medical establishment. The old stories about reviving corpses, which had existed in European folklore long before Bruyère's books were published in the 1740s, still live in the tabloid newspapers, along with tales of alien abductions, crop circles, spontaneous human combustion, and snakes living as parasites in the human stomach. In particular, the legend of the careless anatomist has considerable staying power in modern folklore. In one version, a corpse revives in a New York mortuary and grasps the anatomist's throat. The doctor falls dead from the shock. In another version, the living corpse starts struggling with an undertaker before succumbing to a heart attack. In a third, two timorous doctors drop dead from shock when a corpse suddenly sits up and bursts into a drinking song. Another of these old legends, that of the lecherous monk, is revived in a recent distasteful newspaper story, adapted to suit the shallow morality of the reader of sensationalist newspapers. The corpse of a young girl revives after being raped in the mortuary by a perverted grave robber. It is usually added that the girl's parents did not press charges against the rapist, but instead thanked him for their daughter's life. In one popular newspaper myth, the reviving corpse is considered a ghost by the family and relatives. In another, the corpse sits up in the coffin after being struck by lightning. The readers of tabloid newspapers are easily amused, and most of the tales about reviving corpses are much less elaborate than these. The headline is adjusted to appeal to the vulgar mind and the low intellect. Dead wrong, an undertaker's moving story, or a grave mistake. It is deemed extremely funny if the dead granny revives in the mortuary and all the guests run out in terror, or if the dead man leaps out of the coffin and runs away. The latter motif is repeated in many variations. Many of the reports are from Italy or Australia for some reason. The journalists seem to credit the Mediterranean and Antipodian peoples with astounding powers of resurrection. Occasionally, the dead man or woman jumping out of the coffin meets an uncertain fate. In one story, the Maltese Joseph Cremano leaps out of the coffin and jitterbugs down the church aisle before falling dead in front of the astounded congregation. In another, an apparently dead Romanian woman recovers inside her coffin and opens the lid while it is actually lowered into the grave. She jumps out of the coffin and runs out into the road where she is hit by a car and killed. An amusing variation known from Japan and Australia involves a naked streaker arrested by the police. He is released when he proves that he has actually jumped out of a coffin in a morgue. Sometimes an added twist brings in the age-old concept that the Grim Reaper must have his due, although the victim might be changed. When the Sicilian Antonio Perselli jumps out of his coffin alive and well, his mother has a heart attack and drops dead by the graveside. In a story from Saudi Arabia, a man falls from a windmill, and his family presume that he is dead and bury him. After a day, the prematurely buried man awakes to the sound of grazing sheep walking above his grave. His screams are heard by some shepherds, and he is dug up. With remarkable resilience for someone who has just survived a premature burial, he walks home in his burial shroud. When his mother and sister see him, they go mad and drop dead. According to one version of this story, which could not be officially corroborated, the prematurely buried man goes mad as well and winds up in an asylum. Any reader still inclined to believe what they read in the newspapers should compare two clippings from London newspapers dated 1992 and 1995. Tragic Julie Carson dropped dead in a New York funeral parlor when her mother Julia came back to life, sat up in her coffin and asked what was going on. And Connie Palmer died in a funeral parlor in Wellington, New Zealand, after her heart attack victim mum, Carol, sat up in her coffin. The reworking of invented old news as new was a commonly used technique among Victorian journalists and remains current today. An equally ludicrous newspaper myth is that of the bumpy ride in the hearse. When a wealthy American is taken to his funeral in a luxury hearse, a tire blows, and the hearse skids through the front window of a rival undertaker's parlor. The hearse's back doors fly open and the coffin is flung into the premises. The hearse driver and the mourners are astonished to see the alleged corpse walking out through the shattered glass, dressed in his white burial robes. In a variation, a thief steals the hearse and crashes it into a tree. The rescue team that goes to the scene of the accident is astonished to hear a squeaky voice from the coffin plead, "I'm not dead, don't bury me." In the full-blown urban legend on this theme, a student is hired as a temporary hearse driver. He drives along a road with many potholes as the corpse in the coffin revives and knocks on the lid. The student stops at a phone booth and calls an ambulance, but is too impatient to await it and drives the hearse at breakneck speed toward the nearest hospital. Halfway there, he crashes into the ambulance, and the woman in the coffin is killed. But not all newspaper stories of people mistakenly declared dead are frauds, myths, or hoaxes. As we know, quite a few recent reports of people reviving after taking drug overdoses are beyond reproach. There are also a few instances of people erroneously declared dead through the gross carelessness of the individual signing the death certificate. For example, 86-year-old Mildred Clark was declared dead by a New York coroner, not a doctor, and put in a morgue cooler. She had been there for an hour and a half when the morgue supervisor saw her move. The coroner was hounded by the press. In April 1996, the 59-year-old diabetic Maureen Jones collapsed in her cottage in Thwing, Humberside. She probably had eaten too little, which had caused the blood glucose to fall to dangerously low levels. Her son alarmed her family doctor, who came to see her patient not long afterward, but without finding any signs of life. Maureen Jones was declared dead, and a hearse came to collect her body, but when a sharp-eyed police constable saw her foot move, she was rushed off into intensive care. The careless doctor was sued, as she deserved to be. Maureen Jones was still alive in 1999. As we saw, the leaders of the anti-premature burial movement of the 1890s were facing an uphill struggle. The political and medical establishment stood united to treat their alarmist propaganda with a mixture of disgust and ridicule. The doctors were particularly annoyed by the propagandists' blatant distrust of the medical profession. It was in those years that the form of aberrant behavior was actually pathologized. In 1891, the Italian psychiatrist E. Morselli described what he termed a novel form of mental aberration, taphophobia, or the exaggerated fear of being buried alive. The patient he described had put a clause into his will stipulating that a candle, food, and drink be put in his coffin after he was presumed to be dead, and that the coffin be equipped with air holes and an alarm. Despairing even of this safeguard, he finally desired to be stabbed in the heart as a more definite method of prevention. A German psychiatrist described a similar case not long thereafter. A hypochondriac neuras- neurasthenic man lived in fear of premature burial and frequently visited his family doctor to be reassured that his arteries would be cut after death. In 1942, an American psychiatrist reported two cases of taphophobia, which he described as an idea not infrequently encountered in psychoanalytic practice. The obsessive fear of being buried alive usually began in childhood and became a frequent source of nightmares and bedwetting. A man suffering from severe taphophobia indulged in fantasies of being buried alive day and night and insisted that his coffin be equipped with electric wiring and an air tube. A review on taphophobia, published in 1977, adds two more cases. A 52-year-old woman who had lived in fear of premature burial for 40 years and her 18-year-old daughter, who shared the same predicament. The daughter was the victim of severe anxiety neurosis. No further articles on taphophobia have been added to the scholarly literature, but although this diagnosis is rarely made in modern European psychiatry, there are indications that some American phobia specialists are not unfamiliar with the condition. In spite of Morselli's claim, taphophobia was, of course, not a new diagnosis in 1891. What was new was only the declaration that this form of aberrant behavior was pathological and the coining of a name for this disease. An extreme case of taphophobia had been described already in 1862 concerning an English lady who feared premature burial so much that it embittered her life. Some historians have chosen to extend the definition of taphophobia to embrace all individuals who feared being buried prematurely, like Madame Necker, Arthur Schopenhauer, and H.C. Andersen. But to do this is to ignore the definition of phobia as an irrational fear. If a person living in 2001 would have his or her life embittered by anxiety about being wrongly declared dead and prematurely buried, he or she would be considered to be suffering from a highly unusual and distressing syndrome of aberrant behavior. After all, every modern doctor would agree that the risk of being accidentally buried alive is much less than that of falling victim to one of the perils of modern industrialized state, being killed or maimed in a traffic accident or shot in the street by a robber. The modern psychiatrist would probably suspect either that the person had a distressing experience at an early age involving an undead corpse, or that the taphophobia was a kind of repressed fear of death. But the 18th and early 19th century people who were anxious about the uncertainty of the signs of death had support from a considerable part of the medical establishment, as well as several prominent public figures. Famous doctors and scientists like Winslow, Buffon, Frank Hufeland, and Julia de Fontenelle agree that the risk of a premature burial was considerable, and leading citizens like Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick, Madame Necker, and Cardinal Donnet advocated burial reform to stop this abuse. Thus, the fears of these people in former times can by no means be considered irrational, but must be regarded as a product of their environment. The deep primal fear of awakening in the coffin after burial was fueled by the medical and social establishment, and the pan European epidemic of taphophobia that followed was no wonder. It is known that the prevailing fears of society can be influenced by the contemporary medical debate. For example, bacteriophobia, the fear of contagion, did not exist before the discovery of microorganisms as transmitters of disease and has become scarcer after the discovery of effective antibiotics. In his original treatise, Morselli described his taphophobia patients along with some cases of another psychological aberration, dysmorphophobia, the delusion of being remarkably ugly. It is instructive that while taphophobia has become increasingly rare, an epidemic of dysmorphophobia is raging in the United States, whence it has spread to the wealthy, over consuming European countries, brought on by unrealistic body ideas and the power of mass suggestion provided by late 20th century advertisement techniques and fueled by the plastic surgery industry's desire for further business. The rage for cosmetic surgery shows no sign of abating. As an epidemic of aberrant behavior, it is more extensive and probably more deleterious than the habit of worried Victorians to go shopping for coffins with an ejection seat. As we know, the mid 18th century process of de-Christianization of death facilitated the spread of the fear of premature burial. But both the traditional fear of hell and the new fear of being buried alive were expressions of a deeper, underlying fear of death, a remnant of the child's natural feeling of omnipotence. To be immortal and the center of the world remains in most people, and this irrational belief serves the beneficial purpose of protecting against the fear of death. But this brittle psychological defense fails in a child or adolescent frightened at an impressionable age by a thunderous sermon describing the torments of souls in hell, or terrorized by a sadistic pamphlet about scratched coffin lids, bloody shrouds, and convulsively clenched skeleton hands full of human hair. The fear of being buried alive has another parallel with the traditional belief in the afterlife. Neither the wretch condemned to burn in hell nor the person who awakened in a coffin to scream and scratch the unyielding coffin walls could ever return and tell others about his experiences. This inherent uncertainty about exactly how many people were buried alive explains some of the subject's fascination. It was stressed by the anti premature burial campaigners who boldly asserted that as many as 1/10 of humanity was buried alive. As we noted, however, modern forensic science has revealed that the finding of corpses and skeletons in strange and macabre attitudes, which inspired so many horror stories about the horrid scuffle in the coffin, were actually not incompatible with putrefactive post-mortem changes or with the wounds inflicted by rodents feeding on the dead body. Let's look at this. The number of books and pamphlets above and medical articles below on apparent death and the risk of premature burial plotted over time in France, what's that say? Block bars? Black bars? Oh, Germany, shaded bars, and Britain and the United States, white bars. It is impossible to draw conclusions from exhumation findings alone. How many people were actually buried alive in the 18th and 19th centuries? There are numerous instances on record from the 17th century right up to our own time of people who were mistakenly diagnosed as dead by doctors or lay people, but who afterward recovered in morgues or hearses or even in their coffins. There are also a few accounts, confirmed by reliable medical professionals, of people actually buried alive who recovered in their coffins and called for assistance by knocking on the lid. These few reports are very unlikely to represent the total number of premature burials at this time. Given a strong bias against publication, many cases have probably been suppressed by concerns for the family of the prematurely buried person or a wish to conceal the identity of the doctor who made the fatal error. So, are people still being buried alive? The sheer number of people dying each year, some of them in underdeveloped countries where the legal framework for the verification of death resembles that of 19th century Europe, renders it difficult to answer this question in the negative. In the United States and the rest of the Western world, efficient safeguards against premature burial are in place, in particularly an obligatory medical examination of the deceased. But even these safeguards have been proven to be fallible. and some instances of gross incompetence on the part of the attending physician, and in several 20th century cases of severe hypothermia after intoxication with CNS depressants. The German nurse Minna Braun was very lucky not to be buried alive after a suicide attempt in 1919, and in the 1970s a young Frenchman was detected to be alive when the lid was about to be screwed onto his coffin in the undertaker's shop. Others may have been less fortunate. Indeed, the best preventive measure for those fearing a premature burial may well be avoid taking a drug overdose while outdoors in cold weather. A few of these presumptive suicides are likely to have been buried alive, and it is by no means impossible that some of them actually awoke in their coffins after burial to die a second death much more horrible than they had intended. Today, it would be possible to construct super mortuaries staffed by doctors specially trained to detect states and apparent death and equipped with modern technology to assess the biological activity of various organs, but the cost for such facilities would be immense. And modern health economists would hardly consider it cost effective to build mortuaries all over the United States to save just one or two people a year. If the medical profession's attitude toward apparent death and premature burial depends on the individual doctor's confidence in applying the currently used signs of death, the popular fear of premature burial is a function of the public confidence in the medical profession at large. That profession was relatively confident in the signs of death in the early 1700s, but its confidence dwindled after the publication of Bruyère's books. The most extreme expression of this decline was the establishment of the German waiting mortuaries. The fierce mid 19th century premature burial debate in France resulted from a rise in the medical profession's confidence in the signs of death at a time when the public confidence in doctors remained low, at least partly because the irresponsible newspaper press published many invented cases of people being buried alive. Not until the 1880s could Eugene Bouchet and his adherents declare themselves the victors of the debate. And not until the 1910s did the organized anti premature burial movement collapse. A minor premature burial scare in continental Europe in the late 1970s and early 1980s was very likely a reaction to the redefinition of death to whole brain criteria, but in spite of some horror mongering books and a spate of magazine and newspaper articles, this scare was of brief duration. The medical profession closed ranks around the new death criteria, and the spread of general education meant that people were less susceptible to the alarmist propaganda and more disposed to trust the medical establishment. With regard to the brain death controversy, people were probably influenced by the concurrent horror propaganda about brain dead people maintained on life support. The fear of being kept alive indefinitely in a comatose state served as an effective antidote to any residual fear of premature burial. The growing practice of embalming and cremation also effectively deter fear of premature burial. American morticians were right to claim that any corpse that had passed through their embalming workshop would never wake up again. Another argument is that the distance between the dead and the living is greater in the late 20th and early 21st centuries than ever before. Many Americans have never seen a corpse, and those who have probably encountered only the travesty of a beautiful death concocted in the mortician's beauty parlor. Nor is the prevailing present day lifestyle in the United States and large parts of the Western world set by egotistical, hyperactive people obsessed with amassing money and luxury goods, conducive to gloomy contemplation of death or fear of a possible life after burial. Nevertheless, I will conclude this book with the following thought from John Weaver's 17th century book of epitaphs. So many burials, reader, in one book, warned thee that one day thou for death must look. There's the notes. Read them as fast as you can because this book is done. Where was that page I'd like to go back to? Angelo Hayes. All right. That's all, bruvs. Goodbye. Goodbye.